So, what's the United States up to again? President Donald Trump may have been under attack. The attacker is probably a young teacher from California. But of course, there are a lot of conspiracies surrounding the whole situation with the shooting at Donald Trump, or rather, the shooting in the next room from where Donald Trump was sitting. And since memories of the old ugly shooting in 2025, where he got a nice photogenic souvenir, have now been stirred up, let's break it down. Because it seems to me that people tend to look for stories that aren't really stories at all, and in reality, they're looking for connections where those connections don't necessarily exist. I'll say up front that it makes sense. Because Donald Trump's American administration is extremely untrustworthy and unfocused. Non-transparent means that they don't communicate honestly and openly, often use propaganda rhetoric, and are able to label people who are clearly not attackers and are actually victims as terrorists. In other words, the way Donald Trump's administration communicates is very emotional, very idealistic, and quite irrational. And for that reason, the administration has extremely low public trust. That trust has fallen below 35%, so it makes sense that people are turning to conspiracy theories. Because when you don't trust the official administration, you try to come up with your own stories, your own explanations. And for that reason, it's no coincidence that in countries where the government is the least transparent and corruption is the highest, people believe in conspiracy theories the most. In countries where the government is, let's say, more trustworthy, where it communicates well and corruption isn't such a problem, belief in conspiracy theories drops rapidly. So it's absolutely logical that in the United States, both now and in the past, belief in conspiracy theories is huge because the American state is extremely corrupt in its relationship with its own citizens. Wealthy elites do things that the average American can only dream about, and some of those things might be more like nightmares. Besides that, things like insider trading are happening right now, probably within the American administration, which is a serious crime in the United States, but it seems that people around the president are doing it and nothing happens to anyone. So, yeah, it makes perfect sense that people are just spinning conspiracy theories. And now, what are those theories? Now I'm going to throw out some conspiracies, some explanations that say why all these things that happened both yesterday and a year ago could be staged. In other words, why it could be theater and why people think so. And then I'll throw a wrench into it and knock down those little conspiracy sandcastles. For example, this situation, the shooting at Trump outside, everyone remembers it, the great photo that won Trump the election. People say it's really strange because the shooting happened at a moment when the photographers were gathered up front as if there was going to be a photo taken. At the same time, the shooting happened just as the American flag was being lowered a bit, so it would be clearly visible behind Donald Trump. And at that moment, the shooting happened by chance. It only hit his ear. And at that moment, Donald Trump could have this epic photo, as if the whole thing was just staged. Sure, that's one angle, one way you can look at it. Or you could say that Donald Trump was at the end of his speech. At the same time, journalists and photographers were being brought forward to take pictures of him, and at the same time, the flag was being lowered because they wanted to have those final photos with the American flag in the background. Yeah, that's one possible explanation. And at the same time, the shooter who fired chose that exact moment to shoot when all this was happening because there was some movement. The attention of the security could have been distracted. And besides that, suddenly there were a lot of journalists, cameras, and photographers positioned perfectly right in front of Donald Trump. That means that his attack, if it had been successful, would have been perfectly captured on all the cameras from different angles, which is something that, as a shooter who wants to send a message and do something historic, you would want. So you can look at it as if the whole thing was staged. That's why the cameras were there. That's why that camera was pulled back. That's why it happened at that exact time. But in reality, it could just as well be And it's probably the more likely version that the shooter simply chose the most suitable possible moment to do it. And the most suitable moment was when there were some reorganizations, movements, and a lot of situations happening that the security and people around the president had to react to, and therefore their attention could have been scattered. And then there's another argument which says, well, but Donald Trump, if his ear was shut off, how can his ear be fine? The ear being fine, that's just wrong. Look, that's obviously an interesting argument, but plastic surgery exists. Plastic surgery definitely exists. And if you're Donald Trump, a vain president, you probably wouldn't want to have a completely deformed ear or a massive scar on your ear or something like that. So you'd have it fixed. At the same time, when it comes to ears, the scarring usually isn't very visible. So at this point, if the president is wearing some makeup or something like that, and we know he wears a lot of makeup, then it's really not a good argument or proof that he wasn't shot in the ear just because the ear looks whole and doesn't appear to be scarred or deformed. He simply had it fixed by a surgeon if it was significantly damaged, and he wears makeup to cover up any traces of scars if there are any. That's it. That's what's happening. So that's it. That's the first conspiracy, the first broken little mold, the first broken sandcastle. But as I said, I'm not surprised that people come up with these conspiracies because his administration, his policies, the whole American state is extremely untrustworthy for the average American. And that brings us this idea that the attacks were staged to this next event, to this attack that happened a few days ago at one of the galas, where there were the vice president, the president, their wives, politicians, and people are saying that this attack is really kind of strange. And why do they think the attack is strange? Well, first of all, they find Donald Trump's reaction strange at the moment when the shot was fired. Because we can see that here Donald Trump is just kind of focused. Someone is explaining something to him with cards, probably some program or something, and suddenly gunfire breaks out. Everyone reacts extremely scared, and Trump is just like, first time. But I don't necessarily think it means he knows something, because after all, he's an old man. His reactions are delayed and slowed down, and I think that could excuse him. It's quite possible that he didn't even really hear what happened, and overall the slowness of the man doesn't allow him to have any kind of hyper-reaction. That's the first point. The second point, and this one seems to me to be absolutely the most crucial, is that if it was staged, then both the president and the security would have to know about it, and of course the attacker would have to know about it too. That's too many people. And at this point, we know that the attacker was caught. He was caught alive. That means he wasn't killed. That means he could theoretically talk in the future. That means effectively it can't be like this because you wouldn't risk him talking. At the same time, of course, if he were killed, theoretically at that moment, it could be like that because he would disappear and be gone. So in this regard, considering that the attacker survived, it seems unlikely to me that he was just an actor in some kind of show. Moreover, when you look at how the entire security team reacts, you can see that the movements and the overall reaction are quite confused. We know that at first they took the vice president away and left the president there for a while, so it wasn't done completely correctly. The whole operation, the evacuation operation, wasn't completely perfect. That means there were some inaccuracies, some chaos, some lack of knowledge, something like that. And considering that the security here obviously didn't know something was about to happen, otherwise they wouldn't have reacted so panicked, because we saw that there was disorganization. At that moment, if the security wasn't informed or wouldn't have been informed that the attacker was just an actor, they could have killed him. And if the attacker knew that the security didn't know, then as an actor he would never take part in that, because he would be at risk of being killed. And you probably wouldn't take part in something where, you know, the chance of being killed is massive. The fact that he wasn't killed is obviously interesting, and he's incredibly lucky that he wasn't killed, obviously, but that doesn't rule out that it could have been staged because a live attacker is more dangerous than a dead attacker. And he's also more credible when he's alive. If he were dead, there would be even more room for some kind of conspiracy theories. Another argument is that Trump never goes to these kinds of galas, that he always skips them, that Obama used to attend these events very often and so on, and Trump doesn't attend these events. And now suddenly, when he attended this event, that's exactly when the guy from California attacked. Well, sure, you could say, aha, he went to the event so that the attack could happen there because they needed to stage it somehow. So suddenly he went to an event he normally doesn't attend so they could stage it. But it could also be completely the other way around. It could be exactly that Trump usually doesn't go to these not perfectly secured events where there are lots of journalists, lots of people, lots of movement. The hotel or the place where it's happening can't be set up like a fortress and so on. So at the moment when he goes to one of these events and it's known about, if you're someone who wants to kill the president, for example, or something like that, you pick exactly these kinds of events, exactly this kind of situation, and take advantage of the opportunity. So it's not like Trump went to some gala event so that he could be attacked, so that they could stage it and so on and make a big show out of it or something. No, it's just that Trump simply went there, and since it's one of the few opportunities when something like that could be done, they just did it. And that's it. That's the explanation. And the argument is that this massive event was organized so that Trump would get approval to have a ballroom or some kind of large hall built in the White House where these things could be done, because this wasn't done in the White House, but in the Hilton Hotel, if I'm not mistaken. So just because they would do a massive operation where there would be shooting, where you'd have a hired actor, where you'd endanger a lot of people, that seems really crazy to me and like a total overcomplication of the whole situation. So, ladies and gentlemen, look, the simplest explanation, the most boring explanation is probably what actually happened. A year ago, in 2025, someone really did shoot at Trump, and they shot at him at the moment that was most advantageous for the shooter. At a time with lots of movement and activity, journalists moving, the flag being lowered, security can't fully focus on individuals due to all the commotion. This time, it was simply that an exceptional event was happening, and you had an exceptional opportunity to do what you wanted, and then it was used by the attacker to carry out his attack. Why does this happen to Trump so often? Because he's an absolute maniac. And these things happen to extreme madmen who disrupt the order in the country. And when someone disrupts the order in the country and society, it often happens that someone decides to remove them. Because, for example, they believe they're acting on a higher moral principle. You convince yourself there's some higher moral principle, and then this person may feel that this is the thing they should do. I've written about it and I've said it and I'll say it again. I don't know if the attempted assassination of Donald Trump is a good thing or a bad thing. Given what kind of person Donald Trump is, what his policies are, and where he's heading, only history will judge whether the attack on Donald Trump was an act of heroism or an act of terrorism. The future will decide that, and it will decide based on what Trump does next or what his actions may still cause. At this moment, I'm not able to judge whether it's good or bad, because right now I'm not able to determine what Trump's endgame is, what he wants to achieve, what he's capable of, and what he will do in the future. So that's that. Anyway, fine, we'll see what comes of it. Personally, I think it's just the simplest and most logical explanation that some person decided to end Donald Trump's madness by letting his own madness take over and decided to put a lot of people in danger, and luckily he didn't succeed. And I wouldn't look for any other conspiracies in it, but I'm not surprised that people will, because right now the country is led by a completely incompetent person with a totally incompetent and untrustworthy administration, and that's exactly what fuels conspiracy theories, aggression, and division. And that's all. Ladies and gentlemen, support this work if you want to. Don't spread conspiracy theories unnecessarily. Don't be overly emotional. Discuss in the comments, and I'll see you again for another one. Come to the streams, send money through the QR code, and just do all these wonderful things. And definitely don't forget to like and share, because liking and sharing, meaning sending this video to other people or sharing it on your social media and tagging my YouTube channel or maybe Instagram, that's one of the things you can do completely for free. It costs nothing and it really helps a lot. All right, see you.